Here's how it started, and I'm going to tell it to you plain. At Sunday dinner, my daughter slid a grocery receipt across my plate like it was a napkin. Red pen, circles around milk bread and my arthritis cream. She tapped the total with her nail and said, "Your share, Mom." The roast was still steaming. The grandkids were passing rolls. Mark poured himself more sweet tea and didn't look up. I stared at the red ink until the numbers blurred. I used to think they cared. The house is on Sycamore Street, where the maples run tall and the mailboxes lean like tired men. Vanessa calls it home, the way people say a word they want to be true. It's a split level with beige siding and a front porch swing that never swings because nobody sits. When I moved in, she had washed the sheets in lavender and put a photo of us from my retirement party on the nightstand. My name is Rachel Whitmore. I taught English at Maple Ridge High for 32 years, comma splices, and Walt Whitman, and kids who thought poetry was punishment until it wasn't. I am not helpless. But that night, with a receipt on my plate and red ink judging me, I felt small enough to fold into a napkin ring. "Just so we keep things fair," Vanessa said, smiling like it didn't sting. "It's easier when it's written down." Easier for who? I didn't argue. I took out my wallet like a polite stranger. Mark reached for the green beans. "You know how tight it is with the interest rates," he said, voice smooth. "We're just organizing." They had started using that word a lot. Organizing. The last time someone said that to me with a smile, a principal tried to move my class period to the storage room temporarily and never moved it back. When the dishes were done and the kids were upstairs, I took the receipt to the guest room and slid it into a folder already holding 3 others. A new habit. Proof looks like paper at first. Later, it becomes a spine. The next morning, I walked to the diner because some places still remember you when your family doesn't. Whitmore's sits 2 blocks off Main, white letters, peeling on the window coffee pots older than half the town, and a counter with a crack through the laminate that looks like a river on a map. My husband and I used to split a piece of lemon pie there after Sunday service, just the 2 of us, and Pastor Jim nodding over a crossword in the corner. The smell of bacon and hot coffee is its own hymn. "Morning," Ms. Whitmore said. Jasmine, the college kid who waitresses between classes. She calls me Ms. Whitmore like the teenagers did respect without being told. "You want your usual?" I did. But I also wanted quiet, so I sat in the back booth under the faded picture of the Little League champions from '98 and watched the door. The diner is where people talk when they don't mean to. Mark comes in twice a week, meets clients in camo caps and polo shirts, talks about tax shelters like they're fishing holes. He didn't come in that morning. I paid cash. I kept the receipt. On the way home, I cut through the church parking lot because the ladies were setting up for the rummage sale in the basement, and I could manage the smell of old coats if it meant hearing voices that didn't cut. Miss Carol, who runs the pie table like a general with frosting in her hair, waved me over. "Your Vanessa told me you moved in," she said, lifting a crock-pot lid and letting steam fog her glasses. "How you settling?" I told her the truth you can say out loud. It's different. Miss Carol made that humming sound Southerners make even when they live in Ohio. She leaned in. "If you need a quiet job to get out of the house, Pastor's been saying we need someone to organize the archive closet. It's a mess back there." She slid a ring of keys into my palm like a secret. "Start whenever you feel like it." Only later did I understand what a kindness that was. Some people hand you a job. Some people hand you a door. By Friday, the little things had turned into their own weather system. Vanessa started narrating my day to me. "Did you take your pills? Did you write the date on the calendar like I hadn't been capable for 68 years? Mark left a stack of manila folders on the kitchen island with labels like power of attorney and joint ownership draft, and told me not to worry, he'd walk me through it after dinner. He said it the way people say calm down when they're the ones lighting the match. That night, their friend Shannon stopped by Shiny Hair Expensive Boots, the thick kind of perfume that announces you before you turn the corner. She stayed just long enough to tell my daughter she looked tired. and then glanced at me like I was a glass about to spill. You know, she said, too bright, my mom put everything in a trust and it made things so much easier. No surprises. No surprises. Imagine saying that like a blessing. I slept light. The house made noises I hadn't learned yet. Squirrels on the roof. The dryer's last sigh, Mark's voice downstairs on the phone, low and practiced. I couldn't catch words, but I recognized the rhythm, the way a man talks when he thinks he's winning. In the morning, I went to the church basement and opened the archive closet. It smelled like paper and dust and stories no one had asked about in years. I found a box labeled Receipts 1975, 1999, and laughed out loud because God has a sense of humor, and Miss Carol didn't even know she'd given me a perfect alibi. I made a spreadsheet on the pastor's old desktop with a keyboard that stuck on the S. I noted dates, amounts, and notes in the margin. I've always loved margins. That's where the real writing happens. Around noon, a hand tapped my shoulder. Sheriff Nolan. He graduated in '97, sat in the second row. Thought commas were personal attacks and cried in class the day his dog died. He wears the badge like it weighs more than it looks. Ms. Whitmore? He said, looking at the boxes. Heard you were organizing. Sorry to bother. Just wanted to ask if you've heard from the veterans group this week. They're late for their hall rental. We talked about the vets and their missing check. I made a note to call them. Nolan looked like he wanted to say something else, and then didn't. On his way out, he turned. You need anything? He said, voice lower. You call me direct. He slid a card across the table. His thumb lingered like he knew more than he could say in the church basement with the coffee urn gurgling in the corner. Maybe he did. Maybe everyone did. Small towns are loud, even when nobody speaks. That afternoon, I went home and found Mark at the kitchen island with 2 pens and a legal pad. Vanessa was stirring sauce. The TV was on low, a cooking show teaching people how to be gentle with things they would overmix anyway. Perfect timing, Mark said. Let's knock this out while we're all calm. He said calm like he was measuring me for it. I sat. He slid a form toward me with yellow flags where he wanted my signature. Joint ownership, transfer on death, power of attorney. He had initialed little notes in the margin, just standard, like the kind of boy who cheats off your test and tells you it's a study group. Mark, I said, and I kept my voice teacher soft the way you do when a kid is about to lie to your face. I'll have my attorney look this over. Silence. The kind you can hear. Vanessa set the spoon down hard enough to splash. Mom, why are you being like this? We're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to keep things from getting messy later. Later. The later they wanted was a version of me that couldn't read my own name. I stood. I took the packet and the red pen he'd placed on top like a permission slip. I walked to my room. I put the forms in the folder with the receipts. I locked the door. People think you lock a door to keep someone out. Sometimes you lock it to keep yourself in so you don't go marching back into the kitchen and set a match to the whole thing before your plan is baked through. After dark, Emma knocked with her soft little knuckles. My granddaughter, 12, going on too smart for her own good. She slid under the quilt like a cat. Dad says you're confused, she said, eyes big. But you helped me with my essay, and I got an A. Then I guess I'm confused about the wrong things I said. She smiled like she wasn't supposed to, then pulled something from her hoodie pocket. The red pen. He's been looking for this, she whispered and giggled like we were co-conspirators instead of a child and a woman standing on the edge of a cliff. You can keep it. You always like your own pens. After she left, I held the pen. An ordinary thing. Heavy in the hand. I wrote a date at the top of a fresh page in my journal and a sentence I didn't know was a promise, yet I am not signing anything in this house. The next morning at the copy place on Main, 2 big printers that always jam and a bell that rings when the door sticks, I made copies of the forms. The high school kid behind the counter braces and skateboard scuffed to confession peered at the legal paper and then at me. "My mom says you taught her to love books," he said. "She still has the one you gave her when Grandpa died." "Which one?" I asked. "Mrs. Dalloway." He said it like it was a secret password. I left with a thick envelope and the sound of the bell chasing me into the street. The wind pushed hair into my eyes. Across the road, the county building sat as steady as a sermon you didn't want but needed. On the corner, Miss Carroll was waving a Pies Saturday sign like a woman who believes in sugar and salvation equally. The world does not stop spinning when your family sets you on fire. That's the worst part and the best part. I mailed the copies to my attorney with a note that said simply, "Please advise." I slid Sheriff Nolan's card into my wallet. I tucked the red pen in the spine of my journal. And before I went home, I walked 3 extra blocks to look at the diner from across the street. The window caught my reflection, older, yes, but upright the way a person looks when they remember they've stood in harder winds. Inside, Jasmine wiped the counter in slow circles. She glanced up and saw me through the glass, then mouthed the words, "You okay?" I nodded. She tapped her chest twice with her fist. Our little sign from the poetry club nights, when we read hard lines and had to breathe through them. It means, "We're still here. I want to tell you, there was one big moment that swallowed the small ones, but it doesn't work like that." Injustice tends to arrive like Ohio weather blue sky at noon storm by supper. It was 100 tiny humiliations braided together until they could pull something down. But braid something else, and you can pull it back up. If you've ever been the quiet one at a table where everyone's decided who you are, you already know this feeling. The paper cuts that make you bleed before anybody notices you're hurt. The smile you rehearse to keep the peace while you build a plan nobody sees. Stick around. You'll want to hear how this turns. And do me a favor, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels, because I have a feeling some of you have a red pen of your own, and you're ready to write your name where it belongs. I didn't storm out that night. I didn't slam doors or throw accusations. I just closed my bedroom door and pressed my back against it, listening to the quiet hum of the house like it could swallow me whole. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't come with fireworks. It creeps. A grocery receipt, a form slipped across the counter, a whisper planted in the wrong ear. And by the time you notice, it's already sitting at your table with a fork in hand. The next morning, I sat at the little desk in the guest room with the red pen Emma had given me. I opened my journal and drew a line down the middle of the page. On the left, I wrote, "What they say." On the right, "What I see." It was my way of anchoring myself because I could feel the ground shifting. What they say. We're just organizing. What I see Mark using words like transfer and ownership over dinner while Vanessa nods along. What they say Mom's memory isn't what it used to be. What I see, I've been running book clubs and writing groups at the library for years. I can recall the exact line from Whitman's Song of Myself I Am Large, "I contain multitudes." What they say, it'll keep things easier later. What I see, they're preparing a life where I'm not in the room at all. I underlined that last one. Twice. That afternoon, I took the long route to the post office past the diner, past the old movie theater that hasn't played a real film in 20 years, just hosts Bible trivia nights and the occasional town meeting. I had my envelope of copied forms tucked in my purse like contraband. The clerk behind the counter, a boy with acne scars and a voice too deep for his age, didn't even look at me when he stamped it. Priority. He just asked if I wanted insurance. I said yes. Insurance on a piece of paper. Imagine that. By the time I got home, Vanessa had already told the neighbors I was helping out more around the house. That was her phrasing, like I was some live-in maid. I heard it from Miss Lydia across the fence, who leaned over while hanging her laundry. She says you're keeping busy. Good for you. Her tone was sharp enough that I knew she'd been fed more than that. I smiled anyway. In small towns, you learn to smile even when you're bleeding. That night, I found my pill organizer on the kitchen counter wide open. Tuesday's slot empty. It was Monday. My hand shook as I held it, not because I was scared yet, but because I knew what this looked like. If I made a fuss, they'd call it paranoia. If I stayed quiet, they'd call it forgetfulness. Either way, I lost. So I tossed the whole tray in the trash and started a new one from the stash in my purse. Quiet resistance. No announcements. Later, when everyone had gone to bed, I pulled out my old laptop. The thing still made a wheezing sound when it booted up. I set alerts on every account I had. Transactions over $500 ping me. Logins from out of state ping me. Change of password attempts ping me. It wasn't paranoia. It was math. Because every coincidence stacked into a pattern if you wrote it down. The next few weeks blurred together the way storms blur when they don't break but keep circling. Grocery receipts left on the counter. Vanessa leaving sticky notes on my door with totals for utilities. Mark dropping phrases like, "You should think about signing before you forget," with a smile that felt like a blade. And the whispers. God, the whispers. At church, one of the women from Bible study touched my elbow and asked, "Rachel, are you doing okay? Vanessa mentioned you've been a little off. Like I was a switch someone had flipped." I laughed too loud. "I'm fine, just reorganizing some things." And the irony of that word organizing tasted bitter in my mouth. But I could feel it happening. The shift. People tilting their heads when I walked into the room. Kids avoiding eye contact. Neighbors pausing too long when they waved. It's easy to rewrite someone's story when they're old. One wrong word, one late bill, one misplaced pill, and suddenly you're the poor dear who can't manage. So I gathered proof. I wrote down every slip. The missing pills, the receipts, the overheard calls. One night, I caught Mark in the garage pacing on his phone. I only heard Peace's guardianship equity sign before the quarter ends. I wrote the date, the time, the words. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I just let the ink tell the story he thought I couldn't. And then there was Emma. She'd sneak into my room sometimes when her parents were too busy arguing over bills or real estate schemes. She'd curl up on my quilt and ask me about the past, about when the diner used to be open all night and men in greasy uniforms came in for pie at 2 a.m., about her grandfather who she barely remembered but wanted to. She didn't ask about the sticky notes or the way her mother sighed when I used the wrong mug. But her eyes knew. Kids always know. One night, she asked Grandma, "Do you ever forget things Mom says you do?" I smiled slow the way you do when you're careful not to break. Sometimes, but not the things that matter. She nodded like that was enough. Then she slipped me a drawing she'd made, a red house with flowers out front and a swing on the porch. "For when you get your own place again," she whispered. And then she was gone like a little ghost in sock feet. That drawing is still in my folder right next to the receipts. Proof comes in different forms. The breaking point of that stretch came one Thursday morning. I walked into the kitchen and found a packet waiting for me at the island. Vanessa had left it open like bait. Inside were draft documents for estate planning, power of attorney, transfer on death, a line where my signature would go. But here's the twist someone had already signed. My name. Shaky, but there. I stood there so long the coffee pot beeped at me. My own name forged in my daughter's kitchen. When she came downstairs, I asked her, "Why is my name already on this?" She blinked once. "Oh, Mom, it must have been a mistake from the print shop. They use samples sometimes." Samples. My signature as a sample. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just tucked the packet under my arm and carried it upstairs. That night, I slid it into the folder. Another page in the spine. The next day, I drove to the diner parked across the street and sat in the car with the engine off. Watching, breathing. Jasmine waved from the window like always, but I didn't go in. I just sat there remembering all the years I'd poured coffee for regulars when the diner was ours. remembering how many birthdays had been celebrated in that back booth, remembering that I still owned the deed. That's when it clicked. They didn't just want my accounts. They wanted the diner, the last piece of my husband still standing. And that more than any receipt or sticky note lit the fire in my chest. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was planning. If you've ever been underestimated, treated like you were fading when you were just getting sharper, then you know how Rachel felt in those weeks. Stick around, because the night she finally stood up to them changed everything. And I want to know, have you ever had someone call you forgetful or weak when you knew you were stronger than they realized? Drop it in the comments. You'd be surprised how many of us have been there. The night it all broke open didn't start like a storm. It started with meatloaf. Vanessa set it down on the table, ketchup glaze shining under the light, and Mark poured himself a tall glass of sweet tea like it was any other Thursday. The kids were upstairs with their tablets, the TV hummed softly in the living room, and everything looked normal if you didn't know better. But I knew better, because folded neatly beside my plate wasn't a napkin this time. It was another packet of papers. Only this one had a yellow sticky note on top. Just signed tonight, Mom. Let's get this done. I lifted the packet, thumbed through the pages, and saw the same words I'd been dodging for weeks. Power of attorney, joint ownership, transfer of deed. But this time, the last page already had a notary stamp. My name was signed shaky, but close enough that they thought it would pass. I set the packet back down carefully. My hands didn't tremble. I think because somewhere deep inside me, I'd already been waiting for this exact moment, Rachel Mark said with that false warmth he always put on when he wanted something. We've gone back and forth long enough. It's time. I looked at Vanessa, my own daughter. Her fork hovered over her plate. She couldn't meet my eyes, and that was when something inside me shifted. I'd been gathering proof for weeks, stacking receipts and journals like bricks in a wall. I'd been quiet, careful, deliberate. But now, with forged papers in front of me, it was time to pull the curtain back. I reached into my purse and laid a small recorder on the table. The red light blinked steady. Funny thing, I said softly. This little device has been running every time you've asked me to sign. Every single time. Mark froze. Vanessa's fork clattered against her plate. I sent copies of the recordings to my attorney last week. I continued, my voice calm, even teacher calm, like I was explaining grammar rules to a room of restless teenagers, along with the forged documents and the receipts and the journal. So, if you want me to sign tonight, well, you're too late. The silence that followed was thicker than any sermon pause. Mark's jaw tightened. He reached for the packet like he could somehow undo it all, but I pulled it back and stood. My chair scraped against the tile louder than I meant, but maybe it needed to be. I'll eat later, I said. And I carried the papers back upstairs, slid them into the folder with the others, and locked my door. 3 days later, the summons arrived. Mark and Vanessa had filed a petition in probate court to have me declared incompetent. Unfit to manage my estate, the paperwork said, citing the Elder Concern Act. They painted me as confused, unstable, isolated. They even attached affidavits from 2 of their friends, people I'd barely spoken to, swearing they'd seen me forget names and repeat questions. When my attorney Daniel read the petition out loud in his office, I laughed so hard I cried. Not because it was funny, but because of the gall. To try to erase me in black ink. Daniel just leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. We expected this, he said. We'll answer with proof. Your evaluations, your journals, your statements from church, and the library board. You've done your homework, Rachel. They're the ones who should be nervous. And oh, they should have been. The hearing was set for a Wednesday morning. I wore the navy suit I hadn't touched since my husband's funeral. Smoothed my hair back, pinned it, carried only a folder with my name on it. Courtrooms are colder than you think. They hum with fluorescent lights and smell like old paper and nerves. Mark and Vanessa sat at the opposite table with their attorney, a slick man with shiny shoes and a voice like butter left out too long. He painted me as fragile, delusional prey to outside influences. He leaned hard on my age, called me elderly more times than I could count, like the word itself was a curse. Then they brought their witnesses. 2 acquaintances who claimed I'd once asked the same question 3 times at a barbecue. They spoke in vague circles, secondhand observations, half-truths. I sat still, hands folded, face calm. Years of teaching rowdy teenagers prepared me well for listening to nonsense without reacting. Then Daniel stood. He laid out everything piece by piece. My recent cognitive evaluations, flawless. Sworn statements from my doctor, my financial advisor, 2 neighbors, and 3 members of the church committee I'd served with for years. He introduced my journals as evidence, each entry dated neat, documenting the pills gone missing, the forged signatures, the overheard calls. He even produced the recordings, Mark's voice, clear as a bell, urging me to sign before you forget. And then the twist. Daniel revealed something I hadn't told Mark or Vanessa, because some truths are best saved for when they sting the most. He produced a deed, the diner deed, but not in my name. Years ago, Daniel explained Mrs. Whitmore quietly transferred ownership of the diner to a women's cooperative trust. Independent, irrevocable, and entirely separate from her estate, which means any attempt to leverage it in their favor was based on false assumptions. The judge leaned forward. Vanessa's face went pale. Mark's hands clenched tight around his tie. Furthermore, Daniel continued sliding the forged packet across the table. These documents include a signature that does not match my client's handwriting under forensic analysis. This is attempted fraud. The courtroom buzzed. The judge rapped the gavel for order, then fixed her eyes on Mark and Vanessa's attorney. I don't just find this petition unfounded, she said firmly. I find it an abuse of process. Consider this matter dismissed, and consider whether sanctions should be filed. And just like that, it was over. No shouting, no grand theatrics, just truth laid bare like laundry in the sun. I stood, adjusted my jacket, and walked out without a single glance at Mark or Vanessa. Outside, the marble steps gleamed under weak sunlight. I sat on a bench, pulled out a small flask of tea I'd tucked into my purse, and sipped slow. My name was mine again, my dignity intact. Later that day, Mark tried to call. I let it ring. Vanessa sent a text, "Mom, can we talk?" But I deleted it before the second sentence. Because here's the thing, when people try to erase you, the sweetest revenge isn't yelling or slamming doors. It's standing taller, speaking softer, and letting the truth do the damage. That night, I planted the packet of pansy seeds I'd been saving. Purple and white. Hardy little flowers. They survive frost. They come back stronger in spring. As I pressed the soil down with my bare hands, I whispered to myself, "This is where it turns." And it did. If you've ever had someone try to write you off, call you weak, unstable, or too old, remember Rachel's story. The truth has a way of finding daylight. Stick around, because the fallout of this courtroom battle was just as powerful as the win itself. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to prove yourself in a room where everyone doubted you? Your story might help someone else keep standing. When I walked out of that courtroom, it didn't feel like victory. Not the way you'd imagine anyway. There weren't any balloons or applause. No one lifted me up on their shoulders or played a trumpet. It felt more like standing on a battlefield after the smoke clears your side, still breathing, the other scattered in the dirt, and realizing all you've won is silence. But silence can be enough. The fallout started before I even got home. Maple Ridge is a small town. Word travels faster than fire on a dry August afternoon. By the time I pulled into the church parking lot to return the archive keys to Miss Carroll, she already knew. She hugged me so tight her perfume gardenia with too much powder stuck to my sweater. "Good for you, Rachel," she whispered. It's about time someone told them no. She didn't need to say who them was. Everyone knew. That Sunday, I sat in the third pew, like always. But something was different. Folks who'd been avoiding me suddenly found excuses to say hello. One man I hadn't spoken to in years squeezed my hand a little too long. My mother went through the same thing, he murmured, eyes low. You're braver than I was. I wanted to tell him it wasn't bravery, it was survival. But I just nodded. Meanwhile, across town, Mark's real estate office got quiet. Too quiet. Clients who'd once bragged about his connections stopped taking his calls. His name showed up in whispers, the kind that sound like rumors, but carry the weight of truth. Did you hear tried to take his mother-in-law's diner? Judge called it fraud. The diner, bless it, hadn't even been mine to give. But the fact that I'd outmaneuvered them, that stuck. Vanessa? Well, she didn't come around. Not at first. I'd see her car parked crooked outside the pharmacy or catch her eyes at the grocery store before she darted down another aisle. She had always been the kind of girl who hated looking wrong even as a child. If she spilled milk at the table, she'd hide under the chair until I coaxed her out. Now she was hiding again, only I wasn't coaxing. I moved out of their house the next week. Not because the court ordered it, nobody could force me either way, but because I needed to breathe air that wasn't laced with betrayal. Patrice, my old friend from the library, helped me find a 2-bedroom apartment above a bakery downtown. The walls smelled faintly of yeast and cinnamon, and every morning the hum of the mixers woke me better than any alarm clock. I unpacked slow. Framed photos of my husband on the shelf slipped Emma's little drawing of the red house onto the fridge. With a magnet lined my journals on the windowsill. A woman doesn't need much to feel whole again. Just her things in the right places, her breath steady, her door locked from the inside. Not against family, but against lies. The first night alone, I sat on the balcony with a mug of tea and watched the town move below me. Couples walking dogs, teenagers laughing too loud. Pastor Jim pulling into the diner lot to pick up pie before it sold out. Life didn't stop because my daughter had tried to erase me, and that, oddly enough, felt like mercy. But then came the calls, voicemails stacked up on my phone like unpaid bills. Vanessa's voice tight and shaky. Mom, please, can we just talk? We never meant for it to get this far. Mark's voice, once shorter, more clipped, Rachel. You're hurting the family. Don't do this. I deleted them both. Not out of rage, but out of clarity. If they wanted to talk, they should have thought about that before planting lies in affidavits, before forging my name, before dragging me into court like I was an invalid. The only call I didn't delete came from Emma. Late at night, whispering like she was under the covers with a flashlight. Grandma. Yes, baby. I'm sorry. I know what Mom and Dad said, but I don't believe them. I believe you. My throat caught. Children shouldn't have to pick sides, but life doesn't always let them stay neutral. Thank you, I said soft. That means more than you know. Can I come see you? She asked. Of course, I whispered. Anytime. 2 days later, she showed up on my doorstep with a backpack and that same nervous smile kids get when they're braver than they should have to be. We baked cookies in the little oven, burned half the batch, laughed until the smoke alarm chirped. She drew another picture, this one, of a woman standing tall in front of a small apartment window with flowers blooming outside. That's you now? She said proudly. And maybe it was. The rebuilding part wasn't glamorous. It never is. It looked like sweeping crumbs off the counter in a too-quiet apartment. It looked like walking to the library on Tuesdays to help kids with homework, then staying after to lead genealogy workshops. It looked like filling out applications to start a small grant fund in my husband's name, something for women over 60 who'd been tricked or manipulated by family. I called it the Whitmore Women's Fund. At first, it was just an idea scribbled in a notebook, but Patrice wouldn't let it die. She introduced me to 2 retired professors' women with sharp minds and sharper tongues who helped me set up the paperwork. Within 3 months, we had our first round of applications. Letters from women who'd been locked out of their own bank accounts, pushed out of their homes, convinced they were worthless. Their words sounded like mine, only rougher, sadder. Reading them lit something steady inside me. Not rage, not pity, just resolve. Mark and Vanessa kept trying to reach me. One afternoon, a letter arrived. Thick paper, neat handwriting. Vanessa's apology spilled across 3 pages. We were under pressure. Mark said it was the only way. I thought we could fix it later. But here's the thing about apologies: timing matters. You don't get to burn the house down and then hand someone a candle saying you meant well. I folded the letter, slid it into my desk drawer, and didn't answer. The town took sides, as towns do. Some whispered I was cruel for not forgiving. Others called me strong. I didn't care either way. For the first time in months, I wasn't living in reaction to their voices. I was living in response to my own, and slowly life began to grow around me again. The bakery downstairs started saving me the ends of loaves for toast. Jasmine from the diner invited me to read poetry at open mic night. Sheriff Nolan stopped by once under the pretense of checking in, but mostly just to say he was proud. The roots of Community's small, steady reel started weaving back around me, and I realized I wasn't alone. Not anymore. One night, as I watered the pansies I'd planted in chipped terracotta pots on the balcony, I thought about everything that had happened. About the receipts, the forged signatures, the courtroom. About my daughter's eyes the last time she'd looked at me full of shame she couldn't name. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger. Not even sadness. I just felt free. Because survival isn't loud, it's quiet. It's baking cookies in a too-small oven, teaching kids about commas planting flowers that bloom through frost. It's living your life fully and without apology after someone tried to take it from you. That's the real revenge. If you've ever rebuilt after betrayal, piece by piece, breath by breath, you know it doesn't look like fireworks. It looks like pansies on a balcony and laughter in a kitchen. Stick around for the final chapter, because Rachel's story doesn't just end with survival. It ends with a legacy. And I'd love to know what's something small that made you feel strong again after someone hurt you. Share it in the comments. You never know who might need to hear it. I've heard people say survival is the end of the story. That once you've made it through the storm, you can exhale and close the book. But they're wrong. Survival isn't the ending. It's the beginning of something else entirely. When I finally stood on my own again in that little apartment above the bakery, with pansies blooming on the balcony and the smell of cinnamon drifting through the vents, I realized I had a choice. I could stay small, lie quiet, and let the scars fade into whispers. Or I could take what had been done to me and plant it somewhere it could grow into something bigger than myself. So I chose the latter. The Whitmore Women's Fund officially launched 6 months after the courtroom hearing. At first, it was just a line item in my checkbook and a small circle of retired women who'd agreed to serve as trustees. But then the applications started pouring in. Letters written in shaky cursive and emails sent late at night by women who still shared computers with the very people hurting them. One woman wrote that her son had convinced her to temporarily sign over her farm to keep it safe during a divorce. 2 years later, he sold the land without telling her. Another said her daughter took her Social Security checks and told the neighbors she was helping mom manage. She was left with $20 a week and a pantry stocked only with crackers. Every story I read cracked something open in me. Because they weren't strangers, they were me. Different towns, different names, same wounds. I couldn't fix their families. I couldn't force apologies or rewrite betrayals. But I could put a little bit of power back in their hands. So that's what the fund became, a way to hand a woman a lifeline when everyone around her was cutting ropes. The first grants went out that fall. Small amounts, just enough for a new apartment deposit, a used car tuition for a bookkeeping course. Practical things, not charity, seeds, not pity. I remember one check in particular. A woman named Eloise, 73 years old, who'd been living in her cousin's basement after her daughter drained her retirement. The grant gave her first month's rent on a small trailer and enough left over to buy herself a rocking chair. When she wrote me a thank you note, she said, This chair is the first thing I've owned that no one else can take from me. I sat with that letter for a long time, folded and unfolded it until the creases wore thin, because I knew exactly what she meant. Word about the fund spread quietly, first through the church circuit, then local papers, then the state. I didn't plan it that way, it just happened. Like people had been waiting for something like this, for someone to stand up and say, "We're not invisible." With every story that came in, I felt myself healing a little more. Not because their pain made mine smaller, but because it made me less alone. Vanessa tried again, of course. She sent another letter, shorter this time, almost clipped. "I see what you're doing. I'm proud of you. I hope someday we can talk." I folded that one too and slid it into the desk drawer with the first. Not because I planned to read them again, but because destroying them felt too final. Sometimes you don't need closure, you just need space. The real twist, though, the one that still makes me catch my breath, came when I learned who had tipped off the investigators about Mark. It was her, my daughter. I found out through Daniel, my attorney. He handed me a copy of a federal report, my name listed as a witness marks, as a subject under active investigation. And in the margin, an anonymous tip later traced back to Vanessa's email. She'd cracked long before she'd admitted it to me. And isn't that the strangest part? The same woman who dragged me down by my hair, who circled totals on receipts and forged my name, had also been the one to plant the seed that finally brought Mark's empire down. She never told me herself. Maybe she thought I wouldn't believe her. Maybe it was her way of reaching for redemption without asking for forgiveness. I don't know. What I do know is that Mark's fall came swift. Clients fled. Investigators circled. Eventually, there were charges: fraud, coercion, financial exploitation. His name landed in headlines the way a stone lands in a pond, rippling outward, until everyone in Maple Ridge had heard. Vanessa moved out of their house shortly after. Some folks told me she left him. Others said he left her. I never asked. It wasn't my story to track anymore. What mattered was this: their power over me was gone. By then, the Whitmore Women's Fund had taken on a life of its own. Universities asked to partner with us. Advocacy groups sent invitations to speak. At first, I said no to all of it. I was tired, bone tired, and I didn't think anyone wanted to hear an old woman talk about forged signatures and stolen pills. But then I thought of Emma, my granddaughter, who'd slipped me a red pen like a secret weapon, who'd drawn me a house when I felt homeless, who'd whispered in the dark, "I believe you." And I thought of all the other children out there watching their mothers or grandmothers shrink under the weight of manipulation. So I said yes. The first talk wasn't grand. It was in the basement of the Greenville Community Center, folding chairs, a coffee urn, and about 20 women with notebooks. I told them the truth. Not every detail, but enough. Enough to let them know it could happen to anyone. Enough to let them know they weren't crazy or weak or ungrateful for fighting back. There wasn't applause when I finished, just silence. And then slowly, one woman after another came up to me, a hand on mine, a tear wiped quick, a whisper. Me too. That night, driving home under the yellow streetlights, I realized something. The real revenge wasn't in the courtroom. It wasn't in Mark's fall or Vanessa's shame. The real revenge was in breaking the silence, because silence is where abuse festers. And once you shine a light on it, it shrinks. One evening, months later, I found myself sitting on my balcony, tea in hand, watching the pansies sway in the breeze. Emma was inside painting at the kitchen table. Patrice had just left after dropping off another stack of grant applications. And for the first time in years, I felt whole. Not healed exactly. Healing isn't a finish line, but whole enough to breathe without looking over my shoulder. I thought about all the times I'd been told I was too much, too old, too forgetful. I thought about the forged signatures, the whispers at church, the cold hand of my daughter dragging me across the floor. And then I thought about where I was now. A fund helping women I'd never met. A granddaughter who saw me really saw me. A name that hadn't just survived, but grown roots. I whispered the words into the night air, soft, but sure, I am still here. That's my legacy. Not the diner. Not the money. Not even the fund. My legacy is this truth: when they tried to erase me, I wrote myself back in. So if you've ever had someone tell you you're too small, too weak, too gone to matter, I want you to remember Rachel Whitmore from Maple Ridge. Remember the woman with the red pen, the one who planted pansies in chipped pots and turned betrayal into something that grew. Because survival isn't the end, it's the seed. And you too can choose what it grows into. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And let me know in the comments, what's your I am still here moment? Because stories like this don't just belong to Rachel. They belong to every one of us who's ever been underestimated and refused to disappear.